Previously on Retraced Echoes.
Suddenly they heard screams coming from inside the house. Piercing, terrified screams. It was Matthew, and something was terribly wrong. As they ran into the house, they found Matthew standing there, right in the middle of the kitchen, shaking and pointing. "Monster," whispered a frightened Matthew. Of course, Lydia and Michael, they began to giggle, but Matthew was pointing at the basement door. "A monster's in the basement," he said, still trembling, his breath almost like it's stuck in his throat. The bathroom suddenly felt colder, the air thick with an unexplainable presence, his breath quickening, fogging the mirror right in front of him. He looked up into the mirror, expecting to see nothing more than his own reflection, but what he saw sent a jolt of terror right through him. There in the reflection, just behind him, was a figure, pale-faced with hollow eyes, staring right back at him. It was closer than anything that had ever been, yet utterly impossible to comprehend. He didn't stop running until he collided with his father, his tiny hands gripping Steven's shirt, eyes wide with fear. He woke up to a very faint and distinct noise. He had no clue what it could possibly be, so he would sit up in the bed. Steven's eyes was drawn to the doorway leading to the living room, and there, in the very dim light, stood an old man wearing a red flannel shirt. They would race down the stairs, the house shaking violently as though it was trying to trap them within the very walls, the doors slamming shut right behind them. They wouldn't look back. In fact, they could sense that there was something behind them, almost like it was chasing them down. But they made their way finally outside. The cold night air was hitting them, and it kind of brought them back to the realization that for now they was outside the house and they were safe. As they would drive away, Steven would look up in the rearview mirror. Kids in the back seat looking out the back glass, watching a dark figure going from window to window, almost as though it was searching for the family or anyone that didn't get away. As they would drive further away from the house, they would still hear the banging and the screaming. It was like the house was alive. As they got even further, the dark figure that was in the window, it's almost like it dissipated. Like it found its way back into the shadows of the home. At the right side of Steven's body, it was throbbing. It was throbbing because he kept slamming himself against the boys' doors over and over and over again. In the backseat, the boys, they were silent and trembling. And Lydia, she was sitting in the passenger seat, softly crying. As Steven and the kids would pull into his parents' driveway and walk inside the door, they were still in deep shock. And Steven's dad would break the silence by asking, "Is everyone okay?" Steven would nod, trying to hold back the tears. "I think I'm losing my mind," he whispered. "No, son, you're not losing your mind. These things, they just happen sometimes," his dad would respond. "Let's go figure this out." And with that, they were back on their way to the house. Now the kids, they sat in the car as they watched their dad and their grandparents, as well as their uncle, going back inside the house. The door, it opened slowly. It didn't need to be unlocked. See, in the rush to leave the house, Steven, he didn't even lock it. The living room, when they looked inside, it was quiet. In fact, the whole house, it seemed quiet. There was no sounds, no movement, complete silence. There on the floor laid the cordless phone, a reminder of the events that had happened just mere moments before. "It all seems too quiet," Steven's mom would say. She stared around the room, her eyes wide with fear. And then she whispered as she looked down at her arms, "What's that?" You see, what Steven's mom was looking at was the goosebumps that had just formed on her arms despite how warm the house was. Steven would say, "That's the electrical feeling that I've been telling you and Dad about." That's all she needed to know. She didn't need to hear anything else. She knew that her grandchildren was not safe in this environment anymore. Her grandchildren, in her mind, was never going to step another foot in that house, not as long as she was alive. She would then turn, and she would leave. That's all she needed to know. "I have to pack up some things," Steven said as he headed towards the bedroom, his dad and his brother not very far behind. As Steven would gather the clothing, the things that he and his kids would need, they started to hear it. They started hearing the sounds and voices right above their head. But they knew that was impossible. It was Steven, his dad, and his brother. They were all together. His mom had already left. There was someone else that was en route, which was Steven's sister-in-law. But they knew that wasn't her voice. Steven stood there and tried to pinpoint exactly where that sound was coming from, but he didn't have to think very hard. It was clearly the boys' room, where the sounds and the voices were at. The guys decided that they was going to confront whatever this voice was. Whoever was upstairs. I think to a degree Steven wanted to prove to the other two, hey, this isn't all in my head. This is real. These things are happening. This isn't just electrical charges. This is something else. They would work their way upstairs. As they got to this top and the boy's door was closed, Steven would fling the door open, halfway expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The room, much like when they walked into the house, it was now completely silent. There was a stillness. The stillness was heavy, it was suffocating, and then it hit him. There was a vulgar smell that was in the air. It smelled like death. They would end up covering their nose and their mouth, trying to deal. It's almost like they could taste whatever that was inside the air. Now from downstairs, they would hear the voice of Rita. She was calling out, "Hey, you guys in here? Your mom left to take the kids home." The guys, they would work their way back downstairs. They would see Rita standing in the door. As they got down there, the stench, it was still lingering. Steven's dad would say, "Things seem to be pretty quiet around here now." And as soon as he got the words out of his mouth, again upstairs they started hearing the sound of movement. The whispers started again. Steven's dad would start to say something else when all of a sudden he was quieted by the sound of the unmistakable voice of a young girl's scream piercing through the silence. They all froze. Now, after that scream subsided, there was a heavy breathing sound. "Rita," Steven would whisper over, "hold your breath for just one moment." Tears began to flow down her face, and it became very clear that the breathing was not coming from any of those that was inside the house. It was coming from the shadows, from the very walls of the house. This was no longer a safe environment. "I think we've had enough for the night. Get your stuff, Steven, and come on," his dad would say, his voice shaking. Steven and his brother would gather some of the stuff around the house, and the sounds of the house, it started growing louder. It was more desperate, as though it was alive. It's almost as though it started searching, and it was searching for everyone that was inside the house. It was now hunting. Now, as they would rush to the car, they would hear rustling up in the trees that was almost like it was following them to their car, but above their heads. "Run! Run!" Steven's brother would scream. They didn't look back. They didn't dare look back. The only thing that they knew for certain was that something was coming after them. Something that wouldn't leave them alone very easily. As they would get to the car, they would jump inside and slam the doors, their voices trembling as they sped away, leaving the house behind them. But even as they drove further and further away, they couldn't shake the feeling that They were still being watched. You see, the nightmare, it wasn't over. It wasn't over yet. They would pull back into the drive. They would work their way inside the house, and then Steven would pick up the phone almost instantaneously and dial the number almost by memory. The phone rang several times before Mr. Winters answered. He didn't give him a whole lot of room to comment as the story poured right out of his mouth. "We were attacked last night." Steven just stood there. He didn't even know what to say. I mean, what do you say? He was thinking to himself, "I was just attacked with my family in a house that you just rented to me." And I think at that point, Steven was looking at all this as in, there's no way that Mr. Winters does not know that this house is clearly haunted. How do you rent a house like this, especially with the comment that he had made not that long before they moved in about, "Do you believe in ghosts, Mr. LeChance?" Steven always thought that was a very odd thing to ask, but now it all made sense. See, this wasn't the first time Mr. Winters had heard this conversation. But Mr. Winters, he insisted, "Let's meet at the house tomorrow around, let's say, 1-ish. Now with this, Steven was absolutely torqued off. He was so mad about the entire thing. But Steven thought, if he wants to meet at the house, so be it. If anything, Steven hoped that the very things that was happening inside that house, Mr. Winters could experience it himself. I mean, he was scared of an ice machine that dropped a little bit of ice inside the house. What happens when he experiences all these different things that's happening inside the home? So with that, Steven agreed, and he slammed the phone receiver down. He would turn to his mom and he would say, "I'm meeting the old man at the house." The night would come and the night would go. Steven would be able to sleep one more peaceful night at his parents' without worrying about what would happen inside the house to him or to his kids. The next morning, as Steven would get in the car, he almost laughed because as he looked around, it was just another beautiful summer day. There was a gentle breeze that was blowing. The sky was clear and it was blue. It was a beautiful day. Steven would arrive at the house right at 1 o'clock, and of course, Mr. Winters would not be there. So Steven would go sit on the front steps of the house and just wait. Eventually, he would see the car of Mr. Winters pull into the drive. With him was another woman, which he thought was extremely odd. Mr. Winters and the woman would get out of the car and then walk up to Steven, Mr. Winters holding his wig. He was scared that it might blow away with the little breeze that was happening. As he'd walk up, he would say, "Mr. LeChance, how nice to see you again." His voice was overly cheery. Such a fine day for an outing. I thought that maybe I'd bring my dear friend Lillian out. Bring her out of the home and bring her here with me. Motioning to the woman that was still struggling to get out of the car. "Now, we don't have long to stay, you know. I have to return Lillian to the home very soon," Mr. Winters would continue, making almost like a gesture that they had to speed this along. See, this was an inconvenience for Mr. Winters. And it was almost as though Lillian, he had to get back to the home for the elderly. As they would walk into the house, Lillian would start rubbing her arms. See, there was a little bit of a chill in the air. She would say, "Oh my, it feels so nice and so cool in here." Mr. Winters would pipe up and he would say, "New insulation." See, he had taken so much pride in this house. Almost as though it was a gift to even rent this to Steven. Why in the world would Steven give him such a hard time? This was such a great bargain, such a great house. It was put together so well. But then Mr. Winters would do something that it would catch Steven off guard. he would tell Steven, he would say, "Do you practice witchcraft here, Mr. LeChance?" Now, Steven, this very question was almost like a pointed question. "Yes, Mr. Winters, I do like candles, but I don't think that means that I'm into witchcraft." Steven was so frustrated. First, they walk into the house and Mr. Winters taking credit for this new installation and making it seem like this was such a great deal for Steven. And of course, he asks Steven, does he believe in ghosts not that long ago? And then he said that he didn't believe in that kind of thing. And now he's bringing up witchcraft, almost as though Steven was the one that brought this in because he has all these candles around the house. He was trying to use the candles as an excuse, trying to explain away what couldn't be explained. Now, Lillian would chime in, her voice oddly casual. She would say, "Well, I've heard stories about an Indian chief that haunts this very land." Now, with this, Mr. Winters, he did not like that. He would look right at Lillian, his eyes narrowing down, almost as though he's telling her without telling her. "Why would you say that?" "Well, it is one of the stories that I've heard," she would say. Her tone, it was almost as though she knew she had been caught saying something that she shouldn't say. But with that, Mr. Winters, he quickly shifted the conversation back to business, trying to brush off Lillian's comments. But the air in the room felt charged, almost as though it was like the calm before the storm. As he spoke, Steven couldn't help but feel as though they was being watched. It was like they was waiting for the exact moment to strike. Now, though that scared Steven, he was kind of like, well, if this is going to happen, I would love for it to happen right here. What Mr. Winters finally agreed to, even though he went back and forth with the concept and the idea that this is clearly witchcraft. "Steven, you caused this." He said it without saying it. But he would go through the process of almost blaming Steven. But he would say, the only way that we can truly let you out of the lease, we have to have someone else that will take over the lease. But Mr. Winters had a genius idea. You know, there was a series of people that was attempting to rent the house before you moved in. I passed up so many different people to allow you and your kids to stay here. What a sweet thing for him to do. Maybe I can reach back out to them. In fact, I feel like I know someone that would, if they've not moved in somewhere else, that could probably take over this lease. Of course, Steven would have his own reservations because his thought process was, if Mr. Winters allowed him to move in with his kids, knowing clearly what he knows about this house being haunted, and even Lillian stating some things that she probably shouldn't have said, his thoughts was that more than likely Mr. Winters would do it again, and he didn't want to pass that on to anyone. So he would look Mr. Winters clearly in the eyes and he would say, you cannot allow a family to move into this house. You just can't do it. It's too dangerous. Of course, Mr. Winters would say, oh, yeah, of course, yeah. No families, just single people. So there was a part of Steven that felt conflicted. But he knew that he couldn't stay there, and he wasn't going to pay for rent, and he didn't want to get into any kind of legal trouble by just leaving, since Mr. Winters was not going to allow him to just leave the lease. So with that, he allowed Mr. Winters to do what they needed to do next. So a little bit of time went by, and of course, Mr. Winters would eventually call and say, hey, I've got some great news. Someone does want to move in. They want to take over the lease. Steven said, no family, right? No, everything's fine. Yeah, we've got it all worked out. So I'm going to need you guys to get moved out. So Steven would talk to his dad, and they would determine that it would just be the two of them that would go inside the house and get everything moved out and put onto the moving truck, and then move on with not only the stuff, but with Steven and his kids' lives. Now the moving day, it would finally arrive. They would rent the same truck that they moved to move into the house. It was almost like it was meant to be to a degree, closing a door that was so widely open. As Steven and his dad would leave the rental truck company, Steven's dad would say, "Are you ready for this?" Now, Steven didn't even have to think about this. You see, in his mind, he had thought about this moment over and over and over again. This was the best decision for him and for the kids. He would respond with, "I'm as ready as I'm ever going to be." His voice almost carrying like it was the weight of the world. But on top of all of that, it was like he was pushing that weight off of his shoulders. It felt like no time before they pulled up in front of the house. You see, Steven had been trying to avoid it as much as possible. The only time he'd ever go over to the house from the last time he was there with Mr. Winters was when he would check his mail, and it was always a quick trip. He would literally drive up to the mailbox. He would open his car door, leaving it open. He would rush to the mailbox, grab the mail, and then bolt right back into the car. But now, he couldn't escape it. They had to go inside. They had to get the boxes. They had to move them into the truck. And they worked extremely quickly, removing box after box and trying to ignore the heavy silence that was pressing down on them. They was almost done when again they started hearing, it was like it was a pounding that was happening upstairs. They kept hearing it. Steven's dad, his eyes was wide with fear. See, they remember the last time they was there. Steven would look at his dad and say, "Ignore it, Dad. Just try to ignore it." But the pounding, it just grew louder and louder. And then finally, Steven had had enough. Steven absolutely snapped. He wasn't wanting to be bullied anymore. He would march to the bottom of the stairs and he would yell into the emptiness, "You won. Do you hear me? You won. We're moving out. I'm getting us out of here. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?" Steven would shout. He would slam his fist onto the stair rail, every single word. "If you keep this up, I'll make sure you burn in hell forever," Steven would say. "I've had enough of being bullied." The house remained silent, but it felt like the walls were listening, like they were waiting. Steven and his dad, they finished the move in silence, even though there was a tension that was thick in the air. Steven wasn't expecting to see Mr. Winters there. Mr. Winters would walk up to him. "Well, hello, Mr. LeChance. I'm supposed to meet the new residents here. Have you completely packed your belongings?" His words were calm. But for Steven, he couldn't help but feel ticked off and frustrated and mad. And he became even more angry as he saw another vehicle pulling into the driveway. It was a man, a woman, and two small children. Steven would look at Mr. Winters. "You said that," but before he could even get the rest of the words out, Mr. Winters would cut him off. "Aren't they the sweetest little angels?" Mr. Winters would walk away, not even giving Steven the opportunity to say what he thought, as he walked to the new family with a smile on his face and greet them. Steven would look at his dad, searching for some type of guidance, but there was nothing more that either one of them could do. As they loaded the last box into the truck, Steven's dad put a hand right on Steven's shoulder. "We're finished here. "Son, we're finished." As much as Steven hated it, he got into the truck and they both left. Steven and his dad would take the moving truck to his new spot. They would park the truck in the driveway and then they would head back over to Steven's parents' house for dinner. And it was a relatively quick dinner because Steven had to get he and the kids back to the new home. See, they had to unpack the truck and start getting things moved in. So he would rush, he'd get the kids together. See, the sun was starting to set and he knew that he had very little time to get everything in. Now, he barely had time to start unpacking before he heard someone calling his name. "Mr. LeChance! Mr. LeChance!" Steven knew deep down inside what was coming next. See, the nightmare, it wasn't over. Not yet. Now, as Steven would turn around, he would be perplexed by the experience of seeing Mr. Winters. You see, he never told Mr. Winters his new address. In fact, Mr. Winters didn't even know where his parents lived. So how would he know where he's at now? None of it made any sense. Mr. Winters would explain to Steven that in his rush to get out of the house, him and his dad, he forgot to leave the key, and he had to get the key because he had to give it to the new renter. It's only fair. They're renting his glorious new house. Steven, as he handed him the key, knew that even though his nightmare in his mind at that point in time, even though he thought that maybe it had stopped, that there was about to be another nightmare with another mom and another dad and with two other little kids. He'd very reluctantly hand the key to Mr. Winters, as Mr. Winters would smile and walk away. I wish I could say that the story ended and that everything worked out for Steven and that everything was clear, but it's not really the case. At least not in his book. In the description down below, I'm going to leave a link to Steven's book where you can read every single chapter inside the book. There's 3 different sections. Everything on this podcast was based on what he called the invitation. The next section is called oppression. And I'm pretty sure you know what the 3rd section's called. Because anytime you have an invitation of a demon, you're going to have oppression and then you're going to have possession. Now, though this story is significantly longer, I decided that I was going to end the podcast, but don't leave just yet because we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk pretty candidly about this story to a degree, but I decided to stop it here at the invitation, and I'm going to allow you guys to decide how much further we go into the story in the future. There's so much to the narrative inside this story that any little piece that you take out, I feel like it unravels the entire story. Now, I did watch an interview with Steven. It's probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago. I didn't watch it before I read the book because I wanted to make sure that the story that I told aligned very closely to the book. And sometimes when you watch an interview, it can throw off the way that you tell a story. And for me, I have kind of this narration style that I want to stick with. It's kind of like between me and you, how we tell a story. But there's going to be people that has probably heard this interview and they're going to say, you keep referring to a Mr. Winters, that it was technically a female, and that is true. Steven did explain that when he wrote the book for himself. He didn't write the book for anybody else. It was for him to basically have something to look back on and say, hey, I experienced X, Y, and Z. But when the publisher went to him and said, hey, we might want to change all the women to men and all the men to women. So there's going to be things that's a little bit confusing in that. Now, what's amazing is Steven goes through the process of doing interviews here and there. He hasn't done it. This book's been out for an extremely long time. I think it's been out for like 15 or 20 years. So it's been out for a while. Surprisingly enough, he talked about in the interview how he felt like most people had heard this story. I had never heard this story before, not at all. I would love to do an interview with him. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe that's where this leads to. Now, I've read the entire book, but I'd love to get him on for an interview and allow him to tell about the oppression and the possession. Because I feel though I can tell the story, I feel like it would be handled so much better if he did it himself. So this is an open invitation to Mr. Steven LeChance. I'd love to get you on the podcast and have a conversation about the next 2 sections. Now, if he doesn't get back to me, obviously I reach out to everyone. If you guys want to hear about part 2 and part 3, reach out, and maybe in the near future, maybe we can look at the next 2 sections of Steven's book. But let's hope that he reaches out and we can do an interview, because I'd love to tell that story. Now, we do have a lot more exciting things that's coming up. I actually have an interview coming up with Brooke from the Wildwood Sanitarium, which is based out of New York. I have another podcast, as most of you know, called Deceptive Reality. I do that with my business partner over there, Nick, my co-host. And we're looking at next year going to the haunted Hinsdale house, the Dandy house. That's Paul Kenyon. We did the interview with him not that long ago. We're going to be going to the Hinsdale next fall. That's the goal. But we're also looking to do that maybe on like a Friday, and then on Saturday going to the Wildwood, because it has an extremely fascinating story behind it also. We're going to get with Brooke here in the next coming, actually we're interviewing next week. So depending on if I can get that interview on next Saturday, that will come out hopefully that next Wednesday. I'll be able to edit that interview down Saturday night, maybe Sunday, and then Monday night record my section and hopefully have it all edited and ready to go on Wednesday. That's going to be absolutely fascinating. I'm looking so forward to that. I think that'll be a great story to bring to the podcast. But in addition to that, I'm asking for all of your help. We have Halloween that's coming up. Seems like it's a long way away, but boy, time flies. We have less than a month before Halloween is here. And on the other podcast, Deceptive Reality, Nick and I do something kind of special. What we do is we take listener stories and we recreate them similar to kind of what we do here, and we tell the story there. They're kind of like a quick snippet, like a 15-minute story. But we had a blast last year. A lot of people had a lot of fun with it. I think that it would be a great experience to do this year. Again, I'm going to do a special here on this podcast. Last year I did the Believe It or Not, similar to the old television show, Believe It or Not. I thought that that would be fun. I don't necessarily know that people enjoyed that very much. So I'm trying to think of what I can do, because I don't want to use stories. I want to leave that for Deceptive Reality. In the comments down below, tell me, what do you think would be fun to do? Maybe we could do like a call-in segment, allowing people to call in and tell their stories. That might be something fascinating to do for this podcast. Just tell me in the comments down below, what do you think's fascinating? Maybe you've heard other podcasts do different things, and I would love to definitely hear your opinions on that. Until I see you on the next podcast, goodbye.
In the quiet town where the shadows grow, stands a house that the light won't know. Whispers in the walls, secrets in the floor, a past that lingers, but it wants more. Echoes of a life once lived, now they're here, they won't forgive. Every door that creaks, every light that fades, you can feel the fear that the darkness made. In the house of shadows where the cold wind blows, you can hear the cries, but nobody knows. It's a place of fear, a place of pain. Once you step inside, you won't leave the same. There's a figure in the night with eyes so cold, a story untold, a curse of old. Footsteps follow, but no one's there, just a house of ghosts and unanswered prayers. Feel the chill, the unseen eyes, where the darkness lives and the daylight dies. Every breath you take, every step you make, you're walking on the edge of a grave mistake. In the house of shadows, where the cold wind blows. You can hear the cries but nobody knows. It's a place of fear, a place of pain. Once you step inside, you won't leave the same. You won't leave the same. Feel the chill, the unseen eyes, a haunted whisper pulling you down. In every mirror, a face appears, but it's not your own. It's your deepest fears. In the house of shadows where the cold wind blows, you can hear the cries but nobody knows. It's a place of fear, a place of pain. Once you step inside, you won't leave the same. So beware the house where the shadows play, for once you enter, you're there to stay. The walls have eyes, the floor has a heart, and in the house of shadows is where the haunting starts. You won't leave the same. Where the shadows play, for once you enter, you're there to stay. The walls have eyes, the floor has a heart, and in the house of shadows is where the haunting starts.